The house on the ridge did not welcome us, it watched us. Its locked rooms and sealed wings breathed with secrets too heavy to remain buried. Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, where we sift through the forgotten corners of history and the half-buried memories families try their best to leave behind. Tonight's story takes us into the Appalachian Mountains, a place where the air clings heavy with mist and every hollow holds more than echoes. The hills are older than memory, their ridges carved by centuries of storms, their valleys sheltering communities that seem cut off from the rest of the world. These mountains keep secrets well. Some are etched in stone, others whispered at the fireside, and a few are never spoken aloud at all. This is one of those. I was raised on stories of curses, of specters wandering roads after dusk, of families who bore a mark upon their bloodline. But among all those tales, one rule from my grandmother towered above the rest. There was a name we were never to speak. She did not whisper it in warning, nor cloak it in the language of myth. Instead, she forbade it with a clarity that froze every child in our family into silence. "Never say his name," she would hiss, eyes narrowing, her hand trembling slightly as if the mere thought of it stirred something in the air around her. When I was small, I believed it was a game, a way for her to keep us obedient in a household where shadows lengthened too quickly after sundown. But the older I grew, the more I understood the gravity in her voice. It wasn't the warning of a stern matriarch, no, it was the plea of someone who had seen too much. She would stiffen whenever an old photograph was pulled from the attic trunk, always checking to be sure his face was not among those faded, sepia portraits. If any of us asked, she would slam the album shut and mutter a prayer under her breath. Our family home sat on a ridge above a town that no longer appears on most maps, a cluster of houses slowly devoured by kudzu and time. To outsiders it looked ordinary, a farmhouse with peeling paint and a barn that sagged with age, but to us it was a fortress of silence. There were rooms we didn't enter, portraits that had been cut and trimmed so no trace of him remained, and a study whose door was nailed shut before I was born. Each of these things tied to the man whose name we were forbidden to utter. In the Appalachians, superstition and faith often walk hand in hand, but my grandmother's warning felt different. This wasn't a ghost story told to frighten children into obedience. It was a barrier, a line drawn in language itself. And while I never dared to cross it as a child, curiosity lingers like a splinter under the skin. Why did she fear his name? Who was he to us? And what could a single word, spoken aloud, truly awaken? Tonight, we begin with that silence and the chilling truth hidden within it. For in families like mine, what is left unspoken is often more dangerous than what is told. In our family, there were rules that felt carved deeper than scripture, rules that carried more weight than the commandments we recited in church on Sundays. The greatest of these was simple to say, but impossible to understand. We were never to speak his name. It wasn't explained to us in the way most family rules were, with reasons and lessons attached. There was no story of disobedience ending in punishment, no parable to anchor it in morality. It was just a rule unyielding, absolute, enforced with a sharpness that made it clear it was not to be tested. As children, of course, we did what children always do. We whispered about it in corners, behind barns, or under quilted covers at night when the grown-ups had gone to bed. We didn't know the name itself, not exactly. We only knew there had been someone, a man tied to us by blood, who had been so completely erased that even syllables connected to him felt poisonous. My cousins and I would dare one another to guess, tossing out names half-remembered from gravestones in the churchyard or from faded letters tucked away in the attic. But the truth was, we were guessing at shadows. We never had the real thing because grandmother had burned it out of the family like a sickness. The few times one of us pressed too far, when some reckless cousin thought to tease by stringing together nonsense syllables and calling it the forbidden name, the reaction was always the same. Grandmother would descend like a storm. Her face would pale, her lips thin to a single bloodless line, and her voice, usually soft and cracked with age, would rise with such ferocity that the walls themselves seemed to reverberate. "Stop!" she would cry, louder than I had ever heard her speak in church or at the supper table. "Do not call him, do not bring him here." Then she would cross herself 3 times and demand silence for the rest of the evening. It wasn't just anger in her eyes, though, it was fear. A fear so sharp it seemed to cut her from the inside, leaving her trembling even after she thought no one was watching. Once, when I was no older than 10, I caught her rocking in her chair by the fire long after the others had gone to bed, muttering to herself, "Not again. Never again." She clutched her rosary so tightly the beads left marks in her hands. We didn't understand then, but the weight of her reaction was enough to shape our childhoods. The unspoken became a living presence in that house. Every conversation, every laughter-filled evening, had an undercurrent of silence threaded through it, an absence of sound where a name should have been. And though we tried to dismiss it as superstition, there was always that gnawing question in the back of our minds. What power could a single name hold that made an old woman quake like that? The house where I grew up stood like a sentinel on the edge of a town that time had all but abandoned. From the outside, it was a farmhouse in every sense of the word, with sagging porches and paint long since peeled away by mountain winds. The roofline bent slightly under decades of snow, and the shutters clung by rusted hinges, groaning whenever a storm pressed against them. Yet despite its ruin, it held itself upright, as though unwilling to collapse, bound by something stronger than nails or timber. Travelers passing through might have called it picturesque in its decay, but for us it was a place that breathed differently, as if the walls themselves listened to every word. We were told not to wander into certain parts of it. The eastern wing had been closed off years before I was born. Its doors were nailed shut, its windows covered, and no explanation was offered, except that the floors were unsafe. Still, at night, we would hear the faintest sounds coming from that forgotten wing, the click of a latch, the creak of old boards, the sigh of air where no wind should pass. My cousins and I sometimes dared one another to press our ears against the sealed door, but we always pulled back before long, shivering at the sensation that someone was waiting on the other side, patient and silent. Other rooms were not forbidden, but they were avoided. The upstairs hall always seemed colder than the rest of the house, and no one lingered there longer than necessary. Even the hearth fires below could not chase away the chill that seeped through the floorboards. We told ourselves it was drafts and poor insulation, but deep down, we all knew the house held on to something, something that no warmth could drive out. And then there was the study. The one door that remained locked, not sealed, but guarded with a brass key that never left my grandmother's apron pocket. It was a narrow door of dark oak, scratched and scarred as if someone had once tried to force it open. She never spoke of what lay beyond it, though we knew. That was where his papers were kept. The man whose name was forbidden. We could see it in the way her hand would hover over the pocket that held the key whenever anyone came too close, as though the act of even standing near the threshold risked stirring him back to life. Sometimes, late at night, when the house settled and everyone else was asleep, I would find myself staring down that hallway, my eyes fixed on the outline of the study door in the dim lamplight. I wondered what secrets pressed against its panels, what words were locked away inside that room, and why it felt as though the silence there was deeper than anywhere else in the house. It wasn't just the quiet of disuse, it was the quiet of something buried, waiting. And though I never saw the inside, I carried the certainty that the study belonged more to him than to us, that the walls themselves remembered him even if we were forbidden to speak his name. In our family, he was always the absence in the room, the figure who was never mentioned but somehow shaped everything around us. We called him nothing because we were forbidden even to give him that much. Was he my grandmother's brother, as some whispered when they thought we couldn't hear? Or was he her father, the true patriarch of the house whose shadow still lingered? The stories shifted like smoke, never taking a form solid enough to grasp, and yet the silence surrounding him told us more than any words could. It was not the silence of forgetting, but of deliberate erasure, as though saying nothing at all might keep him from returning. Our family albums carried the most telling clues. Faded photographs with their stiffly posed groups of relatives stood in rows of children and parents, aunts and uncles, all staring with unsmiling eyes into the lens. But in several of these images, there were scars' edges cut too sharply, empty spaces where a body should have been. My grandmother's scissors had been precise. The outlines were jagged, sometimes leaving a sliver of a hand on a sibling's shoulder or a hint of a coat pressed too close to the body beside it. These gaps were more haunting than any full picture. To look at them was to feel the weight of someone who had been there, who had stood among them, only to be sliced out as though he never existed. Even the youngest of us, who had no memory of his presence, felt the pressure of those missing shapes. They were like wounds in the family's history, always open, always raw. And yet, despite the cutting away, traces remained. In the back of drawers, old letters half burned at the edges bore a signature that had been hastily blotted out in ink. In the margins of Bibles, a name scratched out until the page nearly tore. On the inside of the barn door, beneath layers of peeling paint, initials carved deep into the wood, faint but undeniable. It was as though he resisted the family's efforts to erase him, leaving fragments scattered like bones in shallow earth. My grandmother's fear only fed the mystery. She never confirmed who he was to us, never corrected the rumors that trickled down through the years. If pressed, she would tighten her jaw and mutter only that he had been a man of the house once. Her eyes would cloud then, as if memory itself threatened to overwhelm her. That was all she would allow. And yet, the house seemed to remember him in ways my grandmother could not. The locked study still bore his scent of tobacco and something metallic, like iron rusting in the rain. The old floors groaned more loudly at night near the sealed-off wing where, we suspected, he had lived. The man with no name had been carved out of our memory, yes, but not out of the place itself. The walls and the wood still held him, and every silence in our family seemed to lead back to him, waiting just beyond the edge of words. Every family carries its secrets, but in a town as small as ours had once been, whispers always found a way to slip beyond closed doors. Even though my grandmother worked tirelessly to strip his presence from our home, the neighbors remembered. Their recollections were uneven, contradictory, and yet somehow they all carried the same note of unease, as though no one had ever truly known what he was, only what he had left behind. Some swore he had been a preacher. They remembered him standing tall at the edge of the churchyard, Bible in hand, his voice carrying with a strange authority. But they also admitted he never preached inside the church itself. He spoke instead in barns, in fields, or by the riverbank at dusk, drawing small gatherings that grew quickly before suddenly dwindling again. A few old letters in the town archives note complaints about his sermons, describing them as unsuitable for Christian ears and far too concerned with blood, sacrifice, and eternal life not promised by God. Whether he was ever ordained by any church at all was doubtful, yet those who recalled his voice said it could make even the most hardened farmer tremble. Others were certain he had practiced medicine. They claimed he carried remedies, small glass vials of tinctures and powders, promising healing for fevers, wasting sickness, or the mysterious ailments of children. He was called to homes during outbreaks, and though a few insisted he cured those he touched, more quietly admitted that many patients never returned from his care. There was talk of strange instruments, scalpels and syringes of designs unfamiliar even to the town doctor. One family spoke of a daughter who had been taken to him for a lingering cough. She never came home again, and her parents left the town soon after. Unwilling to walk the same streets where others spoke of her as if she had vanished into thin air. But then there were the darker whispers, the ones people would only share after a second glass of whiskey at the tavern or in low tones over a graveyard fence. These voices called him something else entirely, a collector of souls. They said he was neither preacher nor physician, but something older and hungrier. Children, they claimed, feared his shadow. A few even insisted that animals turned skittish in his presence, dogs howling whenever he passed, horses refusing to be led down the road where his house stood. The truth of him fractured under the weight of these stories. Preacher, doctor, or something unspeakable, none of the townsfolk could agree, but all of them agreed on this. He was not a man one could easily forget, and yet, somehow, our family had tried. They buried his name, cut his face from photographs, and locked his papers away. But the community, though it tried to look forward, carried his presence in rumor, as if the land itself resisted the attempt to silence who and what he had been. The discovery came not with fanfare, but with the groan of old wood giving way beneath curious hands. I had been exploring the forgotten corners of the house one late autumn afternoon, the kind of day when the air carried the scent of rain and the mountains outside were veiled in mist. The floorboards in the upstairs hall, warped from decades of damp, had always creaked in peculiar rhythms. On that day, one board bent more deeply than the others, and when I pressed against it, the nails loosened with a reluctant sigh. Beneath lay a cavity, dark and stale, holding something wrapped in oilcloth. My pulse quickened as I dragged it free, a bundle heavier than it looked, smelling faintly of mildew and something metallic like old blood. Inside the wrapping was a book. Its cover was of leather, cracked and blackened with age, the edges stiff as if burned. The binding still held firm, though the pages within were yellowed and brittle. What unsettled me most was not the state of the book, but the feeling that it had been hidden deliberately, tucked away beneath the floor where no casual glance would ever fall. Someone had wanted it out of reach, out of sight, but not destroyed, as if they feared losing what it contained. When I opened it, the first pages seemed harmless enough, columns of names written in a careful hand, alongside dates and small notations. At first, I thought it a ledger of debts, the kind a farmer or merchant might keep, recording bushels of grain or payment owed. But the names were almost entirely those of children, first names only, each one paired with an age that rarely rose above 12. The dates stretched across decades, some entries centuries old if the ink could be trusted. Alongside each name was a symbol, drawn in dark strokes that seemed to curl unnaturally across the page. I had never seen such symbols before. They were not letters from any alphabet I recognized, nor numbers in any language I knew. Some spiraled inward like eyes, others branched outward like veins or roots. A few resembled hands, open or clenched, their fingers bending in ways that did not seem human. Every few pages, one symbol would repeat, identical in its strange geometry, as though marking something complete. The repetition carried the weight of ritual, like a refrain meant to hold power in its recurrence. The more I turned the pages, the colder the room felt. It was not the chill of drafty halls, but something deeper, a weight that pressed against the skin, whispering that the names in this book had not been written merely to be remembered. They had been recorded to be claimed. The ledger did not speak in words I could understand, yet its message was clear enough. These were not accounts of trade or medicine. They were records of something darker, something that tied our family to a legacy my grandmother had tried so hard to erase. Between the years 1908 and 1915, the town's ledger of births and deaths grew tangled with a new and troubling column: disappearances. They were not written in bold ink the way baptisms and marriages were recorded, but tucked at the bottom of pages in the town clerk's neat, reluctant hand. Each entry carried the same hollow refrain: missing, unaccounted for, presumed runaway. But the truth, whispered in kitchens and porches long after sundown, was that these children had not run away. They had been taken, and everyone knew, even if no one would say it aloud. It began with single names: a boy of 9, last seen walking home from school; a girl of 7, sent to fetch water from the well and never returned. Then came 2 brothers who had wandered into the woods to collect kindling. Each entry seemed isolated at first, tragedies of rural life where danger always lurked beyond the fields. But the pattern soon became undeniable. Every child lost was last seen somewhere along the ridge near our family's land. Always close enough to our fences, always within sight of the house that loomed like a watchful sentinel over the hollow. The parents, desperate and grief-stricken, brought their pleas to the sheriff. Old police reports, preserved in brittle folders, tell the same story again and again. Families reporting children missing, neighbors claiming to have seen a figure sometimes on horseback, sometimes on foot, leading the little ones down the path toward our property. At first, the reports carried names, even his, spelled out cautiously by officers who seemed to sense they were treading on forbidden ground. But after 1912, his name vanishes from the records as if scrubbed clean. The reports grow vague, attributing disappearances to unknown causes or likely accidents in the hills. The tone shifts from pursuit to dismissal, as if some invisible hand had reached into the station and pressed the ink dry before it could spell too much. I once asked my grandmother why those years were spoken of in hushed tones, why the school teacher in town would always grow pale when children whispered about the woods. She silenced me with a glare sharper than any blade. "We don't talk about that," she said, her voice trembling not with anger but with dread. And yet, when I later read those faded reports, I understood why she had lived her life behind locked doors and nailed-up rooms. For every missing child, there was no resolution, no found body, no trace but the final sighting near the edge of our land. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. And hanging over every entry, like a shadow no one could erase, was the suspicion that the man with no name had kept a ledger of his own, and that those children's names had not disappeared at all, they had simply been written somewhere else. The church in our town had once been the heart of the community, its white steeple rising above the trees, its bell calling the faithful together each Sunday. But during his lifetime, that unity splintered. The division was not sudden but spread slowly, like rot beneath polished wood. At first, it began with sermons whispered of in disapproval, sermons that did not come from the pulpit, but from the fields, barns, and riverbanks. Families who once gathered together under the Reverend's steady voice began to drift, pulled away by another figure whose words carried a darker kind of conviction. Some said he spoke with authority, quoting scripture but twisting it into shapes unrecognizable, bending the verses to speak not of salvation but of strength, not of heaven, but of something eternal here on earth. The Reverend, a man named Elias Ward, fought back with his own fire. His sermons in the little church turned fierce, filled with warnings of blasphemy and false prophets. The congregation was urged to guard their children closely, to resist the allure of unholy rites disguised as charity or healing. He never named the man directly from the pulpit, but the townspeople knew. Everyone knew. And the more Ward railed against him, the more his following seemed to grow, as though opposition itself fed the strange charisma that clung to him like smoke. I once found a journal belonging to Reverend Ward, its cover cracked and brittle, tucked away in the back of the church's vestry. Its pages, yellowed and smudged with hurried ink, told of sleepless nights and a fear that he confessed even his faith could not ease. In one entry, the Reverend wrote of a man who invokes power through the mouths of children, who sees their innocence not as gift but as fuel. Another passage described strange gatherings held at night, where chanting replaced hymns, and where the voices of children rose in unison to repeat words not in English, not in any tongue the Reverend recognized. He claimed he heard it himself, carried on the wind through the hollow, and though the children's voices trembled, the man's never did. As the years passed, the church itself grew hollow. Families stopped attending altogether, some too frightened, others lured by promises whispered in secret. The pews thinned, the choir faltered, and even the bell fell silent one winter when no one came to ring it. By the time Reverend Ward died, his congregation had dwindled to a handful of the old and faithful, while the rest of the town carried its faith elsewhere into barns, basements, and places where no prayers were spoken. Whatever he was, preacher or fraud, healer or heretic, he had carved the church in two. And long after, the faded journal remained, one of the few surviving testimonies to the shadow he cast, warning that children's voices had been turned into instruments of something unholy, a music that still seemed to echo in the hills if you listened closely enough. In our family, silence was a language all its own, and no subject drew more silence than him. Whenever curiosity overcame me as a child, whenever I tried to ask my grandmother who he truly was or why his name was forbidden, her entire body seemed to shift as though she had been struck. Her face would pale, her lips would draw into a thin, unyielding line, and her eyes would retreat to some distant place I could never follow. She did not shout or scold when the questions came. Instead, she shut down entirely, closing herself behind walls I could not breach. The air between us would turn heavy, the atmosphere in the room thickening until even the other children learned not to press further. It was not the anger of an elder protecting her authority. It was the dread of a woman who had lived with something too monstrous to speak of. One night, long after the lamps had been extinguished, I dared to try again. I was no older than 11, and the shadows in the house had grown unbearable. I asked her why the study remained locked, why the photographs bore their scars of scissors, why the neighbors whispered when we passed. She closed her eyes, her hands knotting the fabric of her apron until her knuckles shone white. And then, in a voice that shook as though dragged from her unwilling throat, she gave the closest thing to an answer she ever allowed. "If you say it, you call him back." Her whisper cracked like a prayer spoken too late. She would say nothing more, no matter how I begged. After that night, I learned that silence was not just avoidance, it was protection. To speak his name, she believed, was to invite him into the room. To question too deeply was to risk stirring him where he lay buried not in earth but in memory, in the fragile space between forgetting and remembering. The weight of her fear settled over us all. We grew into children who knew when to stop asking, who understood that some doors in our family were locked as surely as the study upstairs. And yet the silence did not erase him. It sharpened his presence, turned him into a shadow that loomed at the edge of every story told around the hearth. When we played in the fields, the older cousins warned us not to stray too close to the tree line, not because of wolves or snakes, but because of him. When storms rattled the windows at night, the youngest among us pulled the covers over our heads and whispered to one another that perhaps he was walking again, searching for someone to answer the call of his name. My grandmother never corrected these fears, she only deepened them by keeping her own lips pressed shut, leaving us to imagine what horrors she carried in her memory. Silence became her only defense, and through it, she taught us that forgetting was safer than knowing. But for me, the silence only made the questions grow louder. The discovery came on a sweltering summer afternoon, the kind of day when the air inside the house grew stifling, and the attic called with its strange, dry coolness. I had been rummaging through a trunk that smelled of cedar and dust, searching for nothing in particular when my fingers brushed across a stiff rectangle of card. It was a photograph, the kind mounted on heavy backing that had yellowed at the edges. At first glance, it seemed like so many others our family gathered stiffly in their Sunday best, lined up in front of the porch with solemn faces and formal posture. My grandmother was there as a young girl, her dark hair braided, her gaze already carrying the weight of someone older than her years. Beside her stood relatives I recognized only from whispered names, their faces locked in the strange stillness that early cameras demanded. But it was not the family that drew my attention. It was the figure in the background, almost easy to miss if not for the way the eye seemed to be drawn back to him no matter how many times I tried to focus elsewhere. He stood a little apart from the others, as though he had stepped into the frame at the last moment. His face was blurred not in the accidental way photographs sometimes failed, but in a manner that felt deliberate, unnatural, as though the lens itself had recoiled from capturing him fully. His eyes, though lost in shadow, seemed too dark, like holes burned into the image, and his mouth, it curved upward, but not into a smile. It was a distortion, something that looked like the memory of joy but carried no warmth, only a grimace that unsettled the longer I stared. The longer I held the photograph, the heavier it seemed to grow in my hand. My heart thudded as though I had stumbled upon a secret I was not meant to touch. I turned it over, and there on the back, written in a careful looping script, was his name, the very name my grandmother had forbidden us to speak. The ink had faded, but the letters were still clear, etched into the paper as though time itself could not erase them. A chill ran through me despite the heat pressing against the roof above. I knew I should have hidden the photograph back where I had found it, sealed it once more in the darkness of the trunk. Yet I could not look away, could not force myself to release it. It was the first undeniable proof that he had been real, that he had stood among them, not just as a shadow in stories or whispers. And now I held him in my hands, his face blurred but his name sharp enough to cut. For the first time in my life, the silence of my grandmother's warnings cracked into something tangible, and I realized that some names cling tighter than memory itself. It happened on a night when the house seemed too still, as though it were holding its breath. The others had gone to bed, the lamps extinguished, and only the faint glow of the hearth embers lit the room. I had been staring at the photograph all evening, my eyes tracing the blurred figure in the background until I felt dizzy. The name written on the back pulsed in my mind, each letter pressing against my thoughts like a heartbeat. My grandmother's warning echoed, "Never say it, never call him back," but curiosity has a way of gnawing until silence becomes unbearable. Alone, with no one to hear, I gave in. I whispered the name into the dark. The effect was immediate. The air shifted, heavy and dense, as though the walls themselves had moved closer. The faint draft that always whistled under the door ceased, replaced by a suffocating stillness. A long creak rolled through the floorboards, deeper than the natural settling of old wood, carrying the weight of something rising. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the clock on the mantel had stopped, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. The silence that followed was unnatural, pressing against my ears until I could hear nothing but the thudding of my own heart. Then came the sound from above, a faint dragging, as if furniture long forgotten had shifted across the floor. It came from the sealed-off wing, the place no one entered, the place my grandmother swore had been closed for decades. My eyes fixed on the ceiling, every nerve in my body prickling with the knowledge that I was not alone. The sound grew clearer, slow, and deliberate, like footsteps pacing the length of the locked room. Dust fell in thin trails from the beams overhead, and the air carried with it a faint odor, something metallic, sharp, mingled with the damp musk of rot. I told myself it was coincidence, that the house was old and prone to tricks of the night. But as I sat frozen, I heard it. A whisper. Not a word I could make out, but a low murmur, rising and falling as though someone were speaking just beyond the wall. I pressed my hand to the arm of the chair, grounding myself, but the name I had spoken seemed to linger on my tongue, echoing back at me from the silence of the house. The sealed room groaned once more, and the sound of a latch turning scraped through the air. I could not see it, but I felt it, the awareness of something shifting its gaze toward me, patient and waiting. By speaking the forbidden name, I had opened a door I did not understand, and whatever lay beyond it was no longer content to remain forgotten. The night I opened the forbidden study, the air in the house seemed charged, as though it anticipated what I was about to do. Fear gnawed at me, but curiosity, sharpened by years of silence and shadows, cut deeper. I carried a lantern up the creaking staircase, each step sounding louder than it ever had before, as if the house were warning me back. At the end of the hall stood the oak door, scarred and gouged, its brass handle dulled with time. For years I had passed it, sensing its weight like a watchful eye. That night, I pressed my shoulder against the wood and felt it resist. The lock had long since rusted, but with enough force and the steady push of desperation, the frame gave way with a cracking groan that seemed almost like a cry. The smell hit me first, a pungent mixture of dust, iron, and something sweetly foul, like fruit left too long to rot. The lantern's light wavered as I stepped inside, illuminating shelves that stretched across the walls, sagging under the weight of jars and instruments. The jars, cloudy with age, contained things that defied easy recognition. Some held liquid stained the color of old amber. In others, shapes floated, indistinct, half dissolved, their outlines softened by time. I leaned closer to one and recoiled when I thought I saw the faint suggestion of a small hand pressed against the glass, the fingers too delicate to belong to any animal. The shelves were crowded not only with jars but with instruments I had never seen before. They were not the tools of a farmer, nor entirely those of a physician. Their edges gleamed with unnatural sharpness, their shapes designed for purposes I could not imagine. Long needles, curved blades, clamps etched with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the lantern light. None bore the wear of tools meant for healing. Instead, they carried an air of rituals repeated countless times, precise and deliberate. On the desk at the far side of the room lay stacks of parchment, their surfaces covered in cramped writing and symbols I did not recognize. The sigils twisted across the pages in forms that made the eye ache if studied too long. Some spiraled inward endlessly, others branched out like veins, pulsing with meaning I could not grasp. Here and there were drawings of human forms, not whole but dissected, reduced to diagrams of veins and bones with marks scrawled over the vital points. I stood in that room with my lantern trembling in my hand, and knew, with a clarity that chilled me, that this was no study meant for learning or record-keeping. It was a sanctuary for obsession, a place where silence had not been enough to contain what he sought. The air itself seemed to hum with a presence, thick with the residue of something unholy. My grandmother had locked the door to keep us safe, but the truth was clear. No lock could keep what lived in that room from seeping into the rest of the house and into us. The parchments in the study were brittle to the touch, their edges frayed like leaves left too long in autumn rain. At first they seemed little more than notes, scrawled in hurried hands across yellowed pages, but as I turned them over one by one, I realized they were more than lists or diagrams. They were recordings, transcriptions, carefully captured, as if every sound had mattered. The handwriting varied, some entries tighter, others sprawling as though written in haste, yet all of them carried the same unsettling rhythm. The words did not belong to any language I recognized. They were phonetic, each syllable written as it was heard, drawn out in strange cadences, strings of guttural sounds, broken by sharp consonants that seemed impossible for a child to form. The notes described voices, specifically children's voices, repeating these phrases again and again. Some lines were underlined, others circled, as though the repetition held weight beyond mere practice. I could almost hear them as I traced the words with my eyes. Dozens of small voices rising in eerie unison, chanting syllables that bent and twisted in the mouth. It was not the language of prayer, nor the fumbling chants of children learning hymns. This was something else, something meant to reach beyond the walls of the house into darker places. At the margins of the pages, cold annotations chilled me more than the sounds themselves. Subject compliant, one read. Another bore the phrase, voice faltered, resisted. And then, scattered across multiple entries, I saw the words that stopped my breath entirely. Successful transfer. Beneath them were dates and initials, as though each child had been catalogued by the result of some unspeakable experiment. On other pages, the words failed vessel were scribbled in heavy ink, sometimes followed by lines crossed out so violently, the parchment had nearly torn. The more I read, the clearer it became that these were not records of sermons or teachings. They were tests. The voices of children had been used as instruments, their words bent into channels for something far beyond them. The sigils drawn on earlier pages matched certain notations here, repeated beside the phrases as though marking when the alignment was correct. It was methodical, clinical, and yet utterly inhuman. My lantern flickered as though protesting the words in my hands. I felt the air thicken, as if those transcribed chants lingered still within the walls, waiting to be spoken again. And in that moment, staring at the words, successful transfer, I realized my grandmother's warning had never been about superstition. The name was not simply a memory. It was a call, a vessel, a passage for something that used children's voices as its doorway into the world. In the bottom of the trunk where I had first found the photograph, beneath folded quilts and brittle hymnals, I came across a bundle of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting remained legible enough to bring voices of the past back into the present. These were not family letters, not the warm exchanges between siblings or cousins scattered across towns. They were from neighbors, written in tones of unease, carrying confessions and suspicions that must have been too heavy to speak aloud in their own time. The first was dated 1911 and written in a shaky hand by a farmer who lived down the ridge. He described nights when he saw wagons arriving at our property, always after sundown, always with children inside. He claimed he had watched more than once as small figures were led from the wagons into the barn, their lanterns extinguished as soon as the doors closed. "I have not seen them return," the farmer wrote, "not by morning, not by any day thereafter. I fear to ask, but my eyes do not lie." His words carried the burden of someone torn between duty and dread, acknowledging what he had seen but powerless to confront it. Another letter, written in a firmer hand by a schoolteacher, told of evenings when she passed our house and caught sight of the attic windows. They should have been dark, for the upper floor was said to be sealed, yet she described flickers of light that did not belong to lamplight. "It moves as though alive," she wrote. Blue and white, twisting in patterns I cannot describe. Once, I thought I heard voices joining it, children's voices, lifted not in song, but in some chant I did not understand. I quickened my pace and did not look back. Her words were clipped, as though even committing them to paper threatened to call the memory back too vividly. Other letters spoke more obliquely. A mother grieving her missing daughter mentioned only that the Grady house, though our family name was never written directly, has become a place no child should tread. A storekeeper confessed that he had sold unusual supplies, chemicals, medical instruments, quantities of pitch and oak planks, and wondered aloud why a farm would require such things. None of the letters made open accusations, yet all pointed toward the same truth. The community had known something was wrong. As I read through them, one after another, I felt as though the walls around me leaned closer, listening to their words come alive again. These testimonies were not rumor. They were glimpses into the horror my grandmother had tried to bury in silence. And in every letter there was the same thread, a knowledge that children had been taken into our home and barn and attic, but never, not once, had anyone seen them come back. After that night when I whispered his name into the silence, the house was no longer the same. It was as though I had pulled back a veil that had kept something dormant, and now it stirred restlessly, eager to remind me of my mistake. At first it came subtly, in sounds that could almost be dismissed as tricks of the wind or the groaning of old timbers. But soon the line between imagination and reality blurred, and I knew it was more than the settling of a house. Something had awakened, and it wanted me to know it. The first time I heard the laughter, I was walking along the edge of the property at dusk. The field stretched quiet under the dimming sky, but from the trees beyond came a faint sound, light and high, like children playing far away. I froze, straining to hear. It was laughter, unmistakably, but it was wrong. There was no joy in it, no rise and fall of games or teasing. It was hollow, stretched too thin, echoing strangely as though carried on a wind that blew only for me. The sound followed me back to the porch, fading only when I stepped into the house, leaving my skin crawling with the memory of it. Soon after came the footsteps. They began late at night, when the household had long since gone quiet. At first I thought it was someone stirring, but when I checked, every door was shut, every cousin asleep, my grandmother's steady breathing audible from her room. Yet the steps continued, pacing slow and deliberate down the upstairs hallway. They stopped whenever I gathered the courage to approach, but the moment I returned to my room, they would start again, closer this time, as though they knew I was listening. Once, I pressed my ear to the floor and swore I heard them not only above me, but beneath me as well, circling the house like a predator marking its cage. The worst was the mirror. It stood in the upstairs landing, tall and framed in tarnished silver, a relic passed down through generations. One evening, as I climbed the stairs with a candle, I caught sight of my reflection, but it did not move as I did. For the briefest of moments, it lingered, my face staring back at me a fraction too long after I had turned my head. My skin prickled cold, and when I dared to look again, the reflection smiled. My own mouth had not moved. By then I understood. The name had not been just a word. It was a key, a summons. I had called something back into the house, something that had waited patiently for years in silence. And now it walked the halls again, laughing, pacing, watching, feeding on the terror it knew I could not ignore. When the end drew near for my grandmother, the house grew quieter than I had ever known it. Relatives gathered from distant towns, the rooms filled with the hushed murmurs of kin who came more out of duty than love. She lay in her bed, frail and pale, her once stern features softened by the shadow of death. For days she said little, drifting in and out of sleep, her lips moving only in prayers, whispered too faintly for anyone to hear. But on the final evening, when the others had left her bedside and the lamps burned low, she beckoned me closer with a trembling hand. Her eyes, clouded though they were, fixed on me with a clarity that startled. "You need to know," she rasped, her voice thin as paper. "It cannot end with silence alone." I leaned in, my heart hammering, sensing the weight of what she was about to release. Her hand clutched mine with surprising strength as she said the words I had waited my whole life to hear. He was my brother. The truth settled heavy in the air, more terrible in its simplicity. All those years, all the silence, all the forbidden rules, it came down to blood. She swallowed hard, her breath rattling but pressed on. He believed. He believed children carried a force, something that could be taken, used. He thought it was life itself, the spark that God breathes into them. She coughed then, her voice breaking, but her eyes burned with a desperate need to be heard. He said their laughter, their innocence, it was stronger than the rest of us. He thought if he could drink it, breathe it, steal it, he could live forever. I wanted to pull away, to stop her words before they unraveled any further, but she held me fast. "I helped him," she confessed, her face twisting with shame. "Not in the taking, but in the keeping. I kept his secrets. I locked the doors. I thought, I thought, if I stayed close, I could protect the others. But when I saw what he had become, when I saw the children buried beneath our feet, I knew he had to be stopped." Tears gathered in her fading eyes. "So I sealed him. In this house, in those rooms. Not his body, not his soul, his presence. I bound him with silence. The name is the key. If it is never spoken, he cannot return." Her grip loosened then, her voice faltering to a whisper. "You spoke it, didn't you?" she asked, though it was not a question. Her gaze searched mine, sorrowful but certain. "Then he will come back, and it will not be me who stops him this time." With that, she let go, her hand falling limp against the quilt. The room fell still, the silence of her secret pressing down heavier than the weight of death itself. The storm came without warning, rolling over the mountains like a beast loosed from its chains. By dusk, the sky had blackened, and lightning split the horizon with jagged white scars. The house shuddered with each thunderclap, its old bones groaning in protest. Rain hammered the roof in relentless waves, seeping through cracks, dripping into buckets hastily placed along the hallways. I might have thought it an ordinary storm, fierce but nothing more, if not for the date. It was the anniversary the night he had vanished from the house, the night my grandmother claimed she sealed him away. The air itself seemed to know, vibrating with an energy that had nothing to do with weather. The first sign came as the front door slammed shut, though I had bolted it hours earlier. The sound reverberated through the house, shaking the lanterns on their hooks. I rushed to check it, certain the wind had torn it open, but the bolt still held firm. Yet the wood bore the impact of a force that had come from inside, as though someone unseen had hurled it closed. I stood frozen, listening, and that was when the voices began. At first it was faint, like the murmur of water running beneath the floorboards, but as the storm swelled, the voices grew louder, rising in a chorus that clawed its way into every room. They were children's voices, high, fragile, layered over one another in a tangled harmony of despair. They cried, pleaded, whispered words I could not always understand, until one sound began to repeat, clearer with each wave of thunder. It was his name. Spoken once, then again, then dozens of times, the syllables overlapping until it seemed the very house was chanting, calling him back from whatever place he had been banished to. The boards beneath my feet quivered as if hands were pounding from below, demanding release. I stumbled back as the lantern flickered, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally across the walls. One moment, they were nothing more than branches swaying in the stormlight. The next, they shaped into figures small and slight, their mouths open in silent screams. The air stank of damp earth and something metallic, as though the graves themselves had been overturned. Then, through the din of the storm, his name came again, this time not from the voices below, but from the hallway behind me. Dozens of whispers all at once, hissing from every direction, as though the walls themselves had learned to speak. I turned, but there was no one there, only the long corridor stretching into darkness. My grandmother's warning thundered in my mind: if you say it, you call him back. And now, it seemed, the house itself had taken up the call, eager to bring him through once more. The storm's fury drove me outside, as though the house itself was forcing me toward the place where his shadow had always been strongest. The barn loomed at the edge of the property, its roof sagging, its doors warped by years of neglect, yet I felt an invisible hand pulling me toward it. Lightning lit the path, stark and merciless, while thunder rolled so violently it rattled my ribs. I pushed the heavy doors open, the hinges shrieking in protest, and stepped into the hollow darkness within. The air was thick, damp with the smell of earth and rot, as though the storm had seeped through the walls and brought with it something older than rain. I had been inside the barn countless times as a child, though always uneasily, for its emptiness felt unnatural. Tonight, the emptiness was gone. The boards beneath my feet seemed to pulse, groaning as though strained by the weight of something hidden. In the center of the floor, I noticed a faint outline I had never seen before, a square etched in the planks. My breath caught as I realized it was a trapdoor, its seams packed with dirt and pitch to hide its presence. The storm raged above me, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart as I dropped to my knees and pried at the edges with trembling fingers. The wood resisted, swollen from years of damp, but at last it gave way with a tearing groan. The smell that rose up was suffocating, a stench of decay so thick it coated my tongue. I lowered my lantern into the darkness, and the light revealed what should never have been seen. A chamber stretched below, carved into the earth, its walls lined with coffins arranged in perfect, concentric circles. Dozens of them, child-sized, stacked in orderly precision as if laid by careful hands. Some were sealed tight, their lids nailed shut, while others had been pried open, their contents long since rotted into shadows of bone and cloth. And in the very center of that dreadful design lay a single coffin, its lid wide open. Unlike the others, it was polished, preserved, waiting. The inside was lined in dark fabric, unstained, untouched by time, as though it had been prepared not for the dead but for the living. My lantern flickered as I leaned closer, its flame bending inward as though drawn to the emptiness within. The open coffin seemed to breathe, the shadows within it deepening, pulling at me, promising a place I knew had been reserved all along. The storm howled above, the voices pressed against the floorboards from below, and I understood with sickening clarity that the circles were not only graves, but part of a design. The children were not laid to rest, they were arranged, their silence forming the structure of a ritual. And at its heart waited that coffin, patient and expectant, as though it had always known someone would come to fill it. The house was alive with whispers, but none of them came from the mouths of the living. The storm outside had ebbed into a steady rain, yet inside the walls, his name pulsed like a heartbeat. It was not spoken once or twice, but repeated endlessly, an echo that rolled through every corridor, swelling and collapsing like the tide. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound was not in the air alone. It was in the wood, in the stone, in the marrow of my bones. Every syllable struck me as though the house itself had become a mouth, and I knew then that what my grandmother had feared most had begun to unravel. Drawn by a force I could neither resist nor fully understand, I climbed the stairs toward the sealed study. The door, once locked and splintered, now stood ajar, as if waiting. The faint glow of my lantern barely reached inside, yet even in the gloom, I sensed movement. The shadows did not sit still against the walls but rippled as though stirred by an unseen wind. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. At first, it was only a distortion, the suggestion of a man's shape forming from the air itself. But as the whispers grew louder, the figure solidified. He was there, tall, gaunt, but not entirely flesh. His body wavered at the edges, blurring like smoke, and his face seemed too pale, the features shifting as though refusing to hold still. Yet the eyes, they were fixed and unchanging, two pits of impossible darkness that pierced straight through me. They carried no warmth of kinship, no recognition of blood, only hunger. My voice caught in my throat, but before I could speak, he moved. Not with the clumsy steps of a man, but with a gliding certainty, as if the floor itself bent to his will. He stopped inches away, the cold of his presence crawling across my skin. His lips twisted into that same knot smile I had seen in the photograph, and then he spoke. The words were no louder than a whisper, yet they drowned out every other sound in the house. "You carried me back." The weight of those words crushed me. It was not the storm, not the neighbors' whispers, not even the broken seals of the past. It was me. By saying his name aloud, I had torn open the barrier my grandmother had bound with silence. His voice coiled around me, heavy with triumph, and in that moment I realized there was no mistaking him for ghost or memory. He was something in between, not fully human, not fully gone, lingering in the thin place where names hold power. And now, because of me, he had found the way through. The story of my family does not end with resolution, but with abandonment. The house, once a proud farmhouse standing watch over the hollow, is now little more than a husk. The shutters have rotted away, the roof sagged, the barn collapsed into a skeleton of beams. We left it behind, each of us carrying fragments of silence we could not put back together. No one returned after the final night when his presence slipped through the cracks, when his name rolled from the walls themselves. We did what families always do when something is too monstrous to contain. We buried it in neglect, left it to time, and prayed that time might be stronger than memory. Yet even now, years later, the weight of it clings to me, the whispers never fully quiet. On sleepless nights, I swear I still hear the creak of floorboards pacing through empty rooms, the echo of laughter that does not belong to the living. The photograph is gone, the ledger locked away or destroyed, but the name remains, etched too deeply in my mind to ever fade. I will not speak it again. I will not risk opening that door twice. But I cannot erase what I have done, or the fact that, for a moment, his eyes met mine, and he claimed me as the one who carried him back. So the house stands abandoned, but it is not empty. Travelers sometimes tell of strange lights burning in its windows, though no fire has touched the hearth in decades. Others say they've heard voices in the fields, children crying out in the dark, or the slam of doors carried on nights when no wind stirs. They dismiss it as superstition, as the natural decay of wood and stone, but I know better. I know silence was the only chain that bound him, and I broke it. This is where I leave you, not with answers but with warning. Some stories do not end neatly. Some are meant only to be passed down, heavy with dread, so that others do not repeat the mistakes of those before them. My grandmother tried to protect us with silence, and I shattered it with a single word. Do not make the same mistake. If you find yourself in a forgotten house where photographs bear their scars, where rooms are nailed shut, where no one dares speak of those who came before leave, do not ask, do not pry, and above all, do not speak the names that have been erased. For names are not only labels, names are doors, and once opened, they cannot always be closed.